riverine ecosystems. And Gopa has spent a good part of his time since he got into this field into looking into the conservation of otters and also their habitats, which is actually what is causing a bigger habitat loss for them. There are a lot of dangers to otters because of habitat loss of riparian buffers where a lot of them live. Quite a few things, and I will not take too much time. I will have Gopa talk about them. And the topic for today obviously is the various forests that you find around rivers, right? Whether they're protected forests or not protected. These are critical components of our water security as a country, freshwater security, and a big part of keeping that security going are the otters and the ecosystem services that they provide to all of us. Over to you, Gopa. I'm not going to talk too much about you or further. You are the expert. Over to you about the otters.
Thanks so much, Vikram, and thank you, Subodh. This presentation will take approximately 30 to 35 minutes, and I'm delighted to take questions at the end of it. I am also very happy to see among people who are logged in on the call that I actually know one other person, and that's Chandni, who's done some, whose team along, and all of them do some wonderful work in the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. So warm welcome to you, and thank you for coming in as well, Chandni. I'm going to start with this presentation, and Vikram, are you able to see the?
Yes, Gopa. Yep. Okay. You could even run it in slideshow if you want. I think it'll run fine.
Yeah, I think that's where it is now. Okay, so just to let everyone know that the word riparian is sort of the same as the word riverine, pertaining to the river. And when we talk about riparian buffers, there are riparian forests, right? These are forests which are on either side or generally on one or to either side of a river or a stream. Buffers in particular are lengths or strips of forest on one or both sides, right? And they either merge into the larger forest or they are standalone buffers. And as the word buffer implies, it sort of buffers the river or the stream from what's happening on the other side of it. So we will look at this more as we go forward and look at the kind of love affair that I have with riparian buffers is because of the importance and the sort of unique nature of these ecosystems. As Vikram mentioned, I work on 2 species of otters. I love my otters and I love their habitat even more. The best part about it is most of you, when you see this photo in front, you'd probably be thinking of how it could be just so lovely on a warm, sunny day with a book sitting by this, probably with a glass of something next to you, and silence all around, right? And I'm glad to tell you that this is what I do for a living. So in a sense, you can feel quite rightly jealous, and I join you in that as well. So let's move on and look at this ecosystem and what it means to us and why we should really take efforts to protect it. This is Chandani's home territory, so to speak. It's the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. It's the most beautiful forest I have seen on both sides of the Kaveri River, which those of you who are not from India, it's a sacred river in South India, and it's quite an astonishing ecosystem. And it's home to 177 species of trees belonging to 52 families. So this is an immense amount of biodiversity in this ecosystem. This is just to show you a lovely landscape photograph. And this is, of course, the river in flood, which generally happens in about a month or 2 from now in a normal layout. Let's move on and look at what a good riparian buffer is and what it should look like, right? So just for a moment, focus on the right side of the stream. Generally, a buffer is roughly about 100 feet, 30 meters thereabouts, of forest, of native forest, from the high water mark of the stream or the river, right? If you look at on the left side, it tells us what actually happens as a result. There is a constant, regular interaction between the land and the water. So there is recharging of the groundwater that happens because the water from the stream or the river seeps laterally in and recharges the groundwater. And during the dry season, when the water level comes down in the reverse happens. That's called base flow, by the way. The base flow is when the recharge of the river or the stream happens because water moves from land to water. So where you have a good forest, the stream runs for a much longer period. Where the forest has been destroyed, obviously what happens is in the dry season, the stream or the river runs dry. And that's what's happening in so many parts of the world where these forests have been chopped down. So the base flow is the flow in the reverse direction from the land to the water to keep the water flowing. And we all know how ecologically important that is and economically important it is. I work, for example, in the beautiful, utterly gorgeous landscape of Coorg in Karnataka. And where the buffers have been damaged, we find that the coffee planters, because that's largely coffee cultivation there, the coffee planters suffer because they don't have water for irrigation in summer. So why are these forests really special? Let's look at the speciality of these forests. And of course, the most important reason, as we know, probably intuitively, probably from high school geography, is because these trees, these forests protect the stream and the land from destabilization and from erosion, right? Because what do? They stabilize the flow of the stream, particularly where the gradient is steep, and rich buffers that are well vegetated with grasses and herbs and trees, they slow down the flood water, right? They actually make the water crawl rather than flow. And the rainwater runoff is therefore absorbed. Therefore, it recharges groundwater as well, reduces erosion. This ability of buffers to sort of apply brakes, in a sense, makes the riparian zone really special because it creates sediment, which in turn creates more sediment, which creates a lot of biological activity. And then in a flood, some of that sediment gets washed off, it gets recreated. So that's a natural cycle of runoff and renewal. I just want you to look at these lovely trees, which are in the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. These trees belong to, it's a species called Terminalia arjuna, which is mentioned in a number of mythological books of in Hinduism. It has great religious value. It is revered in the science of Ayurveda and so on. And it has astonishing ecological value because it actually offers habitat to a number of species of wildlife. And we will look at some of this as we go forward as well. So the fact is, there is a tremendous amount of stabilization and protection from erosion. If you were to look at data, the sediment load that's entering the stream can reduce by 60 to 90% as a result of these rich buffers that are in existence. Just for a moment, look at the photo on your right. That's from Iowa. And what we can see, as those of you familiar with Iowa know, wheat is a dominant crop there. So there are these giant wheat fields that run for hundreds of hectares. And when a stream runs through them and you have these buffers, there's going to be a lot of fertilizer, a lot of pesticides that are sprayed. And what the buffers do, and I'm going to come to that in the next slide, in a couple of slides from now, what the buffers do is they actually protect the water, the quality of the water from what happens on the land on either side. So all the kind of abuse, for lack of a better word, of the land that we are doing by spraying chemicals, for example, that insulates, the buffer insulates the water from that abuse, right? What happens when the buffer is depleted? I would like you to look at the tree on the far side, which is at an angle and the roots are exposed. What's actually happened here? People have mined sand, and sand mining is a huge threat to buffers. So when you mine sand, it kind of destabilizes the soil. And during heavy rainfall days, there is more destabilization until the roots get exposed. And now it's a matter of time, days, months, possibly a couple of years before that tree actually falls. Beyond that tree, behind it, is a coffee estate. So what would happen is, if the owners of that estate don't take efforts to come back and protect or restore the buffer, over a period of time, the water will make incursions into the land and into their property, right? So this in turn will ensure that they lose some very valuable topsoil. And if you were to look at an example of where this has already happened, and again, I'm taking an example of Coorg, which is where we work. This is a river which is called the Lakshmana Tirtha. Once again, a sacred river and a tributary of the Kaveri. This is going through a village where the riparian buffer has been entirely damaged on the right side. And where there's a red box, you can actually see what has happened. During high rainfall days, when the water is in a torrent, it hammers against the bank and destabilizes it. If you look a little further ahead, where my cursor is right now, it actually makes an incursion into the bank and takes that soil away. So you can imagine this complete avalanche of water torrenting down this river during high rainfall days, completely brown in color with sediment because the buffer has been depleted. Sand mining and the loss of the buffer go together. So we really need to look at the ecosystem in composite terms to make the conservation efforts happen. But let me move on to the other interesting sort of benefit of that buffers provide us, and that is filtering biocontaminants like coliform and pollutants. And how does that happen? You know, I do as Vikram knows, I do a fair bit of trekking in the Himalayas, and in many parts of the Himalayas, the riparian forests are still pretty good. The buffers are very intact. And where the water flows out of those streams, and in Coorg as well, you can drink it right off. You don't need to filter it. You just need maybe to filter it through cloth to take away maybe little leaf particles and so on, but you can drink it right away. Why is that happening? That happens because of an immense amount of biological activity in the buffers itself. So in a buffer, you actually have inorganic elements. You have sand and you have gravel and you have stones and cobbles and that sort of thing. And you have organic stuff. You have leaves, you have woody biomass, all of which has masses of beneficial bacteria as well as harmful bacteria. And the interaction ensures between the bacteria ensures that the water that comes out is by and large really pure. Once again, if the buffer gets damaged, what happens to the water? It gets polluted, right? Similarly, as we talked about Iowa, you know, if you're going to spray pesticides or have chemical fertilizers, right? If you have a rich buffer, and if you follow where my cursor is, there's there's rainfall that's happening here, and then there's polluted runoff that's moving to the river or the stream, and that runoff. Let me give you examples of runoff. Phosphates and nitrates that come from, for instance, urea and SSP, which are two fertilizers that are commonly used, right? This sort of contamination, which would otherwise cause algae blooms in rivers and streams, these are trapped in the riparian buffers. They're also trapped by not just by the trees, but by the grasses and the shrubs and the natural vegetation. And it's interesting because trees and the vegetation would then use these to develop even further. But what we get in turn are streams and rivers that are much cleaner, that are much more purified. And therefore, we need to keep them undisturbed, right? Planting these buffers up with monocultures is not the solution. We need to have the natural vegetation, particularly grasses and shrubs, coexisting with tree species. And there are some very rich tree species in these buffers, as I explained earlier. But guess what? That's not all. There's so much more that these buffers do for us. They're fabulous wildlife habitat. And Chandni, I hope you're there because this is your territory, so to speak. This lovely endangered bird or a very rare bird is found only in a couple of habitats in India. I don't know about elsewhere in the world, and it's called the lesser fishing eagle, and Kaveri is one of its haunts, so to speak. And this bird, for example, is a bird that depends on the buffer because that's where it typically roosts, and it uses the trees in the riparian buffer as a perching place before it goes down and catches prey from the river, fish and so on. There are more avian species that do exactly this, and let's look at them, right? So there are ospreys, for example, the lovely owl in the middle, which is called the brown fish owl, my favorite bird, and these huge owls that generally roost in pairs in the riparian buffer. The white-bellied sea eagle, even though it's a sea eagle, it frequently makes incursions up river courses. And that lovely hornbill right at the bottom of your screen, which is the pied hornbill, right? Which is eating, in this photograph, it's eating the fruit of a tree that's interestingly that's poisonous to humans. It's called the Strychnus nux vomica, from which they get the poison strychnine. I think, I don't know how you pronounce it, but strychnine or strychnine or whatever. So yeah, thank you. Okay, so that's from the fruit of this tree. But hornbills love that, the pied hornbill, and that's again a riparian bird. So in addition to that, you have more. You have salamanders. You have 125, I repeat that, 125 species of freshwater crabs in India. Freshwater crabs, not saltwater crabs, right? You have numerous frogs, including arboreal or tree-dwelling frogs that are on trees by the river. And you have 27 species of freshwater turtles and tortoises, right? Now, this is the kind of richness, of non-mammalian richness, that buffers actually provide us. And now let's come to mammals. And there we are looking at the elephant in the room, right? So let's look at what happens. So if you were to look at elephants, something that we sort of know at some level, which is elephants love the water. And there are multiple studies that in India that show that where there are rich, intact buffers, elephants use these riparian buffers to travel, because they don't necessarily want to travel through human habitation because of conflict that is inevitable. So herds of elephants would probably use riparian buffers and forests to move across their large ranges, which we all know can run often into multiples of hundreds of kilometers. And there is some data to also show that where these buffers are intact, human-elephant conflict is reduced, right? And let's move on and look at some more of these species. Oh, sorry, before I get into that, this is it's called mutualism. This is mutually beneficial. Just as elephants need these buffers, elephants themselves are seed dispensers, long range, long distance seed dispensers in the buffer. So they themselves are integral to the sustenance of the buffer. Right. And once again, the Kaveri has shown us this, right? The elephants actually disperse number of species, including, for example, syzygium, which is jamun in Hindi, right? If we move on and look at other mammalian species, this is the grizzled giant squirrel, right? And the giant squirrel, right? And if you look at the barking deer, that's another lovely species that is often found in buffers. The giant squirrel, by the way, habitates only the buffer. That's where it is found. And then, of course, we have the gentleman we all know. And he or she, they love buffers as well. And they're frequently found there because they like water and they like to cool off in water. And the species that I study, which is a riparian species, in fact, it's the head of the food chain in the water, which is the river otter, in this case, the smooth-coated otter. Though it's in the river most of the time, it hunts in the river, it eats fish, for example, it uses the buffer, trees like the Terminalia arjuna that we talked about. It uses these trees to have its dens. These dens are called holts, H-O-L-T-S, and that's where they actually reside. That's where they have pups. And they design their holes in such a way, or they pick their holes in such a way that the pups are protected from predators, for instance. So we have seen these in multiple studies that where the buffer is damaged, if at least the sand bank in the river is intact with a lot of grasses, they might reside there. But where the sand bank is damaged as well, otters might visit the area, the stream, to pick up fish, but they'll go right back to where the buffer is rich. So buffers are superbly important for, for all kinds of wildlife, not just mammals, but, you amphibians, avians, you just name it, right? And increasingly, we are understanding just how important these buffers are for some of the species that are declining in numbers across their territory. And sorry, just give me a second. Yeah. Let's look at the final species I want to talk about, and that's fish. How are fish impacted by buffers? We may think that fish being in the water are not particularly affected. But study after study has shown that where fish spawn or where they lay eggs, they prefer cooler water. They prefer higher levels of dissolved oxygen. And that's exactly what buffers provide, right? And buffers also ensure that with their woody debris and so on, they change the stream's physical condition, right? They change the bottom of the stream with the kind of biological activity and the aquatic macroinvertebrates that are present there, with worms and mollusks and insects and crustaceans that are there that consume the wood and the woody biomass that falls from the trees, right? Now, what do fish consume? Exactly all of that, right? Fish consumes worms, for example. So we again see that fish populations decline where buffers are removed for yet another reason, which is where buffers are removed and where there is spraying of pesticide and chemical fertilizer, those pollutants enter the stream and they kill fish, they kill crabs, right? So we work, for example, on the world's smallest otter, which is called the Asian small-clawed otter in Cook. And what we have seen is that where we decide, typically we decide that is commonly called Roundup, which is the chemical name for that is glyphosate, where that is sprayed and the buffers are damaged. We find that these enter ponds and streams. And as a consequence, we have huge populations of crabs that die and fish that exit the area or die, and otters don't enter anymore. We still don't know what happens to the otters, whether they are poisoned because they eat the species that in turn have been poisoned. We don't know whether that's essentially going up the food chain. But what we do know is that the collateral damage is, in a word, unacceptable, right? You may think that I'm just about done and dusted with my story, but I have a little more to tell you. I know this, before I come to that, these are the indigenous communities of Cook, and where the buffer is intact, these people are fishing. And I wanted to show you this remarkable photograph because these people fish in a very interesting way. They look for fish that actually reside where riparian buffers are rich and in shade. The fish reside in shade. So these people look under rocks, for example. The boy you see here, the little boy, he's actually searching under a rock for fish. This man here on this rock closest to you, he's waiting, and he's got a little line out in the water, but that's under the rock on the far side. So these fish actually prefer shade. And where these buffers are rich, people get their protein as well. And I come to probably the final class that I haven't talked about yet, and that is insects, right? How do buffers impact insects, right? I go back to Coorg and to a remarkable study by an outstanding researcher called Dr. Smita Krishnan, to whom I'm hugely indebted for this infographic that we created. So let me take a minute to tell you about it. As we know, those of us who love our morning cup of coffee, we know that coffee essentially is a fruit that needs, coffee flowers need to be pollinated. Let me take you quickly through this infographic. 26 species of birds and insects pollinate coffee. That's right on your top left. But guess what? Just a single species of bee, that's the rock bee, accounts for 58% of pollinated coffee flowers in Cook. And the rock bee prefers to have its hives on 3 species of trees. The first is called locally Dhupa. The scientific name is Viteria indica. The second one is Magnolia champaka, which is the scientific name. The local name is Sampige. And the third one is mango. And all three are riparian species. All three are found in riparian buffers and in riparian forests. And that's where you have dense colonies of hives. And they prefer trees that are not pruned. And on riparian buffers, trees would be left wild, so they wouldn't be pruned, unlike, for example, on estates or agricultural lands. And if you chop those trees, what happens in the last two images you see at the bottom left is your coffee fruit set is down by 33%, a third. In a nutshell, what it's telling us is there's a strong economic argument in addition to an absolutely powerful ecological argument as well. It's a remarkable story of a forest that is truly, truly very special. On that note, this is a place where, incidentally, I've sat and looked for otters because there was otter sprint or otter scat just where I was sitting a couple of feet away. And this is a lovely intact buffer next to, interestingly, about 5 feet away from a road. And on the other side of the road is a very well-known temple. And yet, because the buffer is intact, we have otters in this stream, we have huge amounts of birds, we have fish, we have wonderful wildlife that inhabits this. With that presentation, I'm pretty much done. I trust I have not overshot my time. And they are fillers, they are filters, they help us with fishing, and they are our friends, right? Thank you so much for that. And yes, I'm very happy to take questions. Just give me a second while I open up that. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Menon. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Very interesting to hear and learn about. So yeah, we'll move on to our question and answer session. Before I go to Bharat, there's a question on the chat box where Christopher wanted to know what is your recommendation for the width? How wide should the buffer be?
Thank you, Chris. That's a great question. The recommended width for a buffer, as the minimum recommended width, is 15 to 30 meters, right? Now, is that the optimum width? Answer is no. We would classify this as the minimum width. The optimum width would be, so a 30 meters corresponds to approximately 100 feet. We would say the optimum width would be about 4 to 5 times that. But as we all know, that may not be practical in many situations. Did I answer your question, Christopher?
Yes, thank you. I absolutely agree with that. My wife actually deals with riparian buffers from her previous job, and I would actually completely agree with what you said. I had difficulty getting into the meeting through the passcode, and anyway, so here I am, and thank you. A very good presentation. I'd like to hear the whole lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. I think the main reason why the NGT also prescribes a 30-meter buffer around a lake or any water body is dependent on all these factors, I guess.
Absolutely. And erosion in particular would be a very important factor as far as lakes are concerned. Yes, and for water birds and so on with you. So both, it's wonderful you should bring up that point. So before you take the next question, a quick sort of addition to what you said. Unfortunately, the NGT order, those of you who are not familiar with the full form of NGT, is the National Green Tribunal in India. Unfortunately, that doesn't extend to streams and rivers, but is, as you rightly pointed out, true for ponds and lakes, which are under certain municipalities and so on. Yes.
From what I know, being an architect, depending on the scale of the water body, whether it's a river or a stream or may just be a small rivulet, the standards vary depending on the categorization of the water body. Mm-hmm. So even if you have a stream somewhere, if it is a minor stream, which is not perennial, you may have a buffer of around 8 meters or 9 meters. So the NGT has varying buffer standards for depending on the scale of the water body.
Okay.
So we'll go to Bharat. Bharat, if you may unmute yourself, please, and ask a question.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to know if there is some kind of recommended standard with regards to agricultural land. For example, I have land and there is a stream that it's actually a channel overflow from a lake that flows through the property 3-4 months in a year from June to October or so. So is there some kind of recommended, but right now there are only paddy fields on either side of this, non-perennial stream, but is there something that you would recommend even for a small stream, some kind of tree planting on the edges or some kind of a buffer width, or is that something that you can, this one, even in agricultural land?
Most certainly. So may I ask a question? The agriculture on being done on either side, is that organic agriculture or non-organic?
It's not entirely organic, but it's paddy, but they do use chemical fertilizers, but not pesticides. As far as I know, no pesticides are being used.
Yeah, so that brings me to a point which is very crucial. And thank you, Bharat. The point here is with fertilizers, as far as human risks go, for you and I, the risks of what happens to our health is significantly lesser than when pesticides are sprayed. So if you were to classify evils, for example, for human health, pesticide would be a bigger evil than chemical fertilizers, right? But for the ecosystem, the problem with nitrates, with urea, for example, is a very small percentage. Anywhere between 6 to 12%, I understand from research, is actually what is going up to 15, is what is absorbed by the plant. A lot of it is leached out. So Bharat, the answer to your question is, it may make sense to actually have a buffer which could be a minimum of, if possible, 15 meters. Now that's about 50 feet, and often you don't have the luxury of that. But that would be important to actually have possibly lines of trees and allowing native grasses, which are very, very crucial to grow. So native grasses, what do we mean by that? We mean ensuring that there's no browsing by cattle and goats in partnership with the local community, because otherwise everybody will basically ensure that it is eaten up. So allowing the grasses to grow, which will actually trap these nutrients and not flush them into the stream, right? I think on a scale of importance, I actually value grasses more than trees in the buffer, because that's what traps nutrients from the nutrient point of view. Yes, thank you.
Just to add to the question, the land will be waterlogged for 5 months in a year. So in that case, do we need to, create some embankments, raised embankments on either side? Because otherwise, many of the grass or tree species may not survive waterlogging.
Yeah. So trees will, many species of trees don't survive waterlogging. You're right. Some do. As far as grass is concerned, most species of grass can survive waterlogging. Yeah. Yeah. So you may want to create an embankment. I'm not able to give you a blanket answer to that, but you may want to create an embankment. You're right. Right? Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'll be great if you could, share more details offline and, some photos of the place. Then maybe we could have Gopa and also some of our other restoration experts kind of look at it and give you suggestions. That might be of great value, and that could also be something that we publish on the site for others with similar situations. Because we have in our farm, for example, we have a canal that flows by our canal, and this has given me a lot of ideas to your question. I think that is something that we should all look at, because someone also, and we are about half kilometer from the Kaveri, which flows nearby, and people have said that there's possibilities that otters have also come to the canal often. So building, buffers with all of us wherever we have opportunities might actually help with a lot of those, creating those mini ecosystems.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. Thanks. We'll move on to the next question. Ayman, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Firstly, amazing session. Thank you so much for the information.
Thank you.
So my question was regarding, so if say now there's a riparian buffer that has been destroyed, but there's someone who's trying to restore it, what is the effectiveness of it with respect to buffer that hasn't been touched? Or how long does it take for it to become something that is actually effective to the environment?
So if I understood your question, what you're saying is how long does the restoration process actually take? Is
Essentially,
that
yes.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question. So if you fence, I'm just giving you a kind of just a sort of theoretical answer initially, and then I'll qualify. So if you were to fence off an area, let's assume there's no human and animal activity, animal meaning cattle and goats in that area, right? Grasses come back really quickly. In weeks to months, grasses are fairly flush. Now, there are incidentally numerous videos, numerous photographs that you can see online of what grass roots actually do. They go down so deep that they really trap sediment far more effectively, for example, than the roots of trees do, right? But we don't look at grasses with that lens. So grasses come up and they are the first step in this whole process, right? If you're able to fence off an area, or at least through community support or community cooperation, ensure that there is no incursions into that area, a single season would get your effectiveness up and running. That's the beauty of the whole process, right? Trees will take their time. And sometimes you may have invasive species that are coming in, like lantana camera, for example, which is a really invasive problem. But here's the interesting part. In a really damaged buffer, I would rather have lantana than not have lantana. Though I am very against lantana myself, because it's such an invasive species, right? So having said that and removing it out for a moment, grasses and shrubs will come up fairly quickly. In 1 year, you are up and running, and trees will take the roots of trees to actually take hold and withstand, it takes a decade or more, right? But your restoration process will start in a single season, and that's the good news, right? I also want to share one last bit, which is because these are typically very rich ecosystems, and in most such ecosystems, water is available for most parts of the year. Trees that are adapted to this, and I'll give you one example of a tree we find in our parts, which is a tree called Pongemia glabra. Right? In Kannada, it's called honge, and in Tamil and Malayalam, it's called pongam. Right? This tree, for example, grows very, very rapidly in riparian buffers. Right? Even in non-riparian lands, it grows fairly quickly, but it's a native species and it's fairly beneficial as long as there's not too much of it. So in the Kaveri region, not in the wildlife sanctuary, but outside that, we find that this tree and another tree, which is called Niranji locally, I can't off the top of my head get the scientific name. These two trees, for example, go very quickly. Another tree that grows, another grass, incidentally, that grows very quickly, and all of you are very familiar with this grass, is bamboo. Right? And as we go on the upper courses of the Kaveri River in Karnataka, we have cane as well. So you have forests of bamboo and cane, and these pretty much come up in 2-3 years. And their root systems are fairly vibrant and hold back the soil. So that's brilliant, right? Thank you. Did I answer your question, Ayman?
Yes, yes. I was also going to ask about invasive species, so you answered that as well. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So I guess Ayman is one of our youngest members. Is still in school, Ayman, or have you passed out now?
10th grade. Just finished my exams.
Oh,
Okay,
great. And I'm really proud of your question. I think for somebody in 10th standard, that's a wonderful question to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So if I may follow up with what Ayman asked, we keep talking about all this afforestation programs and planting of trees. How does one figure out what kind of tree should be planted where in these riparian buffers?
Yeah. I would incidentally, I would love to have Chandani's answer to this as well. Chandni, if you would like to add, I would love, because she's a person with immense on-the-ground experience in the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary. I will just preface that by saying, Subodh, again, a really lovely question. In general, I am against the planting of trees in these buffers on a intense basis. What do I mean by that? There is a science, and I use the word science in its actual form, which is called assisted natural restoration, ANR for short. And in ANR, what is done is we allow the natural forest to come up, but in certain sections or with great care, at intervals, we might plant a sapling or two of species that wouldn't, for some reason, come up naturally. So I'll give you one example, which is not true of riparian buffers, but is a generic example. The sandalwood tree is propagated primarily by the droppings of birds, right? So where you don't have a perch for the bird, so if you have cleaned up an area and the bird cannot sit there, you're not going to have sandalwood trees coming up, right? That's one example, but not for riparian buffers. I'm taking a generic example. So my point to you is, if we can pick species that would, and talk to local people and understand from them, what are some of the species that were there earlier that they don't see now, propagate them in the nursery by taking saplings that we find elsewhere, and very selectively plant them. I am for it. But systematic planting of, let's say, at a density of, say, every 10 or 15 feet planting a tree, I would not be for it unless there is a crisis. If we are going to do that, sorry if I'm taking long time to answer. If we are going to do that, the only species I would recommend is local varieties of bamboo and cane. Right? Did I answer your question?
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. So do you want to request Chandni also to shed some light on this?
Yes,
Chandni, are you around?
Hi, Subodh. Hi, Gopa. Yeah.
Hi,
No,
Chandni.
I agree with Gopa, because even when it comes to tree planting, I am also very, very careful. I would rather not go about planting trees randomly, just because, you need to do an afforestation. But understand, as Gopa said, talking to locals will definitely give a lot of insight into what are the native trees. And what happens is, a lot of times, different species of trees are known by different names locally. And I have seen a lot of people getting confused with the tree species and thinking that, and mistaking it for some other species. And a lot of such wrong drives have also happened, wherein wrong trees have landed up in wrong habitats. And that's the worst that can happen with tree planting. It is all right if you do not go about planting trees, but introducing different kinds of species can be very detrimental. So yeah. So like Gopa said,
Yeah,
going
so
by
just to
the
add to
local
that,
knowledge
yeah.
is very important.
In fact, just to add to that, there have been certain cases where there have been scientific experiments use drones to drop off seed balls. And people have found that some of these seed balls actually contained seeds of even invasives. I believe in some areas they found Senna spectabilis, which is one of the problematic invasives in India. They were found in the seed ball. So when large-scale projects are taken up for afforestation or for restoration of a degraded landscape, we need to have patience and value time. Nature knows how to come back. Your job is really to protect that area and keep the invasives out mainly, and keep cattle and other things out, and nature knows how to bring it back. That's usually the best form of tree planting. The best form of tree planting, like we always say, is not to plant trees. So those are some of the things that are out of control of even those with the best of intentions. So tree planting projects, absolutely agree with Chandni and Gopa that they have led to a lot of problematic issues in the past with many projects.
Thanks, Vikram. Would anybody else like to ask any other questions? Chandni has a question for us. Yeah, Chandni, please go ahead.
Thanks, Subodh. Gopa, I have a question regarding your work in Coorg. There are a lot of coffee planters and streams along coffee estates, right? So they also use a lot of these chemical fertilizers.
Yes.
What can you share a few experiences of you working with the coffee estate people who have been using chemical fertilizers and that have transitioned from not using it, and also efforts of restoring the buffers and also maintaining them. So have you been any, I mean, have there been any instances wherein there has been a mindset change and an attitude change in people, particularly in Coorg area?
Right. It's a fascinating question to answer, and it's something that I'm so sort of into on a weekly basis. So the answer to that, there are two parts to that. I'll take the first part, which deals with chemicals in the soil or chemicals that are applied to the plant and to the soil. So there are a very few set of farmers who will approach coffee or any plantation with a moral obligation to do the right thing, which is to say that, for example, organic is a way to protect the soil for future generations. It's a way to ensure there's biological activity. It's a way to ensure that my consumers eat safe food, etc. There's a fraction, maybe somewhere between 1% to 5% of coffee planters, right? The issue, Chandni and everybody else, is actually not the pesticides that are sprayed on coffee, because interestingly, coffee doesn't need too much of chemical pesticide, unlike tea. Tea is far more toxic. Coffee is relatively benign. I use the word relatively. The problem in coffee is actually weedicide and herbicide, and that's where the Roundup bit came in as well. And that's a problem not just in coffee, but in paddy as well. And, ever since these have made their inroads into plantation areas, so these are the problem with these is they actually very quickly get absorbed in, and the runoff happens very quickly, and therefore they're sprayed directly on the grass, right, or on the weeds. They're not sprayed on a coffee plant, because you want to kill the weeds and you want to kill the plants which are seen as weeds on all sides. And therefore they find their way into streams. So there I do have a real challenge on my hands, Chandni. And we started the campaign only last year. So far we've had 100%, no, well, I'm joking. We're close to 100% failure rate, right? But this is not a campaign we can fight in a year. It's a long-term story. And the question some of you may have on the tip of your tongue is there an alternative to a chemical weedicide? Well, till these weedicides came in, there was an alternative, which is far more benign. So initially, people were obviously removing the weeds by hand, and that became a problem because labor costs went out of control. But then there are brush cutters that come in, and brush cutters are very commonly used. I just want to tell you, in case you haven't entirely got a grasp of the problem, there are a couple of weedicides, and there is one which is called 24RD, which are so dangerous that India is one of 3 or 4 countries in the world that still permits their usage. They are extraordinarily toxic. They stay in the soil for years. A single spray stays in the soil for years. And after spraying it, people don't go to the field for a week. This is the nature of toxicity of a weedicide that I'm talking about. So there is a challenge. It has to be addressed. It has to be addressed quickly, but change will be a slow process. The second question that Chandni asked was, do they respect the riparian buffer? In general, I'm happy to tell you, Chandni, that many planters respect it for a couple of reasons. One is broadly on lines of what Subodh had mentioned earlier. There are some government guidelines, and these vary from state to state. In Karnataka, there is a very loosely worded guideline, and by and large, it has been adhered to, with some exceptions. Of course, as all of you know, where a river or a stream goes through a town or through a village or a city, it's not going to be respected, right? But when it goes through a plantation or through agriculture areas in Coorg, for example, by and large, there is decent adherence. I would say well over 50%, closer to 3/4 to 80%, right? So that is, let's say, the only redeeming factor. And those are some of the most magical sort of moments to sit in those buffers. A final point is we work in the landscape called the Brahmagiri Hills. On one side is Coorg and the other side is Wayanad, in Kerala. There, the riparian buffer is intensely damaged. And there we see, and there are known cases of toxicity. Anecdotally, people complain of a lot more illnesses as a result of the poisoning of the water. So we know that there could be anecdotally cause-effect relationships here, but nothing that has been studied and scientifically proven. Chandni, I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, Gopa, thank you so much.
Thank you. Ayman had another question or comment?
Question.
Yeah, it wasn't a question, but with respect to the question that was just asked, and with what you said, sir, I've noticed that this mindset of not caring or of only caring for profit comes from a consumerist mindset. So one of the alternatives to this is giving farmers the bargaining right, which happens. So I'm in my school, there's a fair trade committee, this organization called Fair Trade that helps farmers get equal pay, cares about the environment, gets them minimum wages, stuff like that, educational help. So Fair Trade, what Fair Trade does is gets farmers together, gets them into a community that has this bargaining right, because the farmers are the ones that are growing the crops. They're the ones that we depend on. So if you give them that power, they have the opportunity to choose what they want to do to their land. And so there are companies for coffee instances for coffee as well, such as Black Baza Coffee, that help in or recognize that these natural and habitats are important, and these species like the Luna moth or the Black Baza are important to these localities where the coffee is grown in, and they help in the protection of the species by, for instance, making sure that patches of land are available for them, and and completely organic stuff farming. So I think this is an alternative or an option that you could explore.
Yes,
Getting a farm to become fair trade standardized, that then ensures so many of these things. So it's a benefit for the farmers, it's a benefit for the land and the environment, and for us as a whole.
So I must start by, before I start carrying forward your point, I must start by complimenting you. I think you are so knowledgeable. I'm truly taken aback. And I just think you should keep this up. This is fantastic. I'm delighted to meet somebody like this who's so knowledgeable and is capable of articulating things so beautifully. So full marks to you, Ayman. Thumbs up, right? And you'll be also glad to know that the founder of Black Baza is a friend of mine. So let me tell you, in fact, I had actually forgotten to add this bit in my answer to Chandni's question. So in Coorg, there is a fairly nascent movement, which is driven by, again, a wonderful coffee planter to bring together farmers under a fair trade umbrella. And this is being driven by two organizations, one of which is Nescafe's Nestle India. So Nestle Worldwide is driving this along with another organization, and they are looking at safer practices and in turn offering a slightly higher price, not a significantly higher price, a slightly higher price to coffee farmers, which means that quite a few farmers, actually as of January, so I don't have the current numbers with me, but as of January, there were about 235 farmers who had signed on. All, just for everyone to know, unlike many parts of the world, in Coorg, the coffee planters are really small holders, anywhere between 3 to 50 acres of land. So these planters have come together and they are following certain practices. in return for which they get a remuneration. Now, Chandni, that is one way of dealing with this problem. And Ayman, thank you so much for raising that. And please, I want to emphasize this. Please keep up what you're doing. This is terrific to hear you say this. Most people in 10th standard haven't heard of fair trade, but you not only have heard of it, you know so much about it. I'm truly delighted. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. So, how much of this, before we go on to our next question from Mr. Chandaria, if I may quickly ask, how much of this is actually an awareness issue among farmers?
So, well, it's an interesting question, Subodh, because one is to do with awareness, which I think is fairly widespread. Another one is to do with the biases in human nature, which is beneath the surface. Let me explain for a moment what I mean. It's the old story of smoking. You know that smoking is not good for health, but most people believe that people who smoke often believe that it won't harm me. It might harm somebody else, but I'm immune to it somehow, right? So we call that an optimism bias. We also call that an exclusion bias. Call it what you will. Similarly, people who spray chemical pesticides are the ones who, for example, are personally affected when even if they're not spraying, they're at least walking through their fields. They often believe that it won't happen to me. I'm okay, right? Or it won't happen to people who are, my coffee will continue this way, or my customers, nothing will happen to them. So there is a bias that comes in the way they implement it. The second bias is what we call the principle of social proof. And this is entering the area of sociology now, but very important, which is everybody else is doing it. So why can't I do it as well? Right? If everybody else wasn't doing it, then maybe I would think twice about it. But everybody sprays pesticide. Why are you telling me not to do it? In fact, if I don't do it, the pest will come into my field, right? To the second part, there is a grain of truth, not an awful, whole lot of stuff. But these are but awareness, there is a high, because people in Coorg are generally fairly well educated, the coffee planters. Most of them have an undergraduate degree. They have studied outside Coorg. They've studied in colleges. Many of them have traveled to other coffee growing regions of the world, Brazil, Southeast Asia, Kenya, for example. There's somebody on this call from Kenya, so they've traveled to Kenya as well. So they get a sense of what's happening elsewhere in the world. But it is a reluctance which is built on psychological biases rather than awareness.
All right, thank you. We go on to our next question, Mr. Chandaria. Please go ahead, sir. You need to unmute yourself, please.
Thank you very much. I live opposite Karura Forest in Nairobi, which is one of the big forests within the city of Nairobi, Kenya.
Right.
And there is a huge movement going on all the time for last 50 years to plant trees. We had 11.5% cover of forest cover in Kenya. It ultimately went to 1.5%. Since subsequent help and a lot of work, I think it finally came down to 6%, but we are still very short of what we were when we were 4 million people. Today we are 50 million people. So the question is that whenever the roads are being made and widened, recently near the Karura Forest, now we are having a road going to United Nations headquarters, UNEP and UN Habitat. Lots of trees are being cut off. And I don't think there is a program that once you cut one tree, you plant two. There is not such kind of a law that you get a permission to cut a tree, then you go to plant two. Now, unless and until something of this nature, which becomes a compulsion, it's very difficult to maintain forest. In Nairobi, there are 2-3 forests around us, but the amount of forest cutting going on is just, we just don't know how we can ever come back to the 11% or 10% of the forest cover.
Right. Thank you. That's a perceptive comment. Thank you so much.
Anybody else? Any more questions, please?
Actually, Anu Chingappa, and Anu, I must say that your name is very familiar, probably because of my, in Coorg, Coorg isn't a very large place, so Chingappa is very clearly a Kodwa name. So she's got a comment in the chat box, and have you not been accused of being a fake environmentalist? Well, I'm sure, it's so far I have not been given that label, but I'm sure sometime in future it will be put on me, if at all. And I won't particularly complain. I mean, you take the goods with the not so goods. I mean, it's just part of the whole story, right? But I must tell you that in Coorg, because there is a level of awareness, working with the community is an option, is a way out, where you hear them out, and some of them have very genuine reasons why they can't do what they do. And being part of that and listening to them and using empathy is a very important skill. So I'll just leave it there. That's where we are. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Anybody else, please? Sanjay, are you around?
Yes, Subodh. Yeah, very well here.
Shall we go on to the vote of thanks? If there's anything,
Yes, sure.
Nobody else has anything else to
I
ask.
think no, I think we have also crossed the 8:30 deadline.
So, Sanjay, if you may do the honors, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. At the outset, I thank Mr. Gopakumar Menon for being here with us and letting us know about the subject, the topic of the day. It was fantastic. I should say that in fact, I took some time to log in because of some network issues. I also thank Vikram Hiresave for bringing you here and addressing us. A lot of Rotarian, Rotary Club of Nairobi, and we have Rotarians. We had participation of Rotarians from Trinidad and Tobago, and we had participation of members from different parts of India. So thank you all for joining. And for those who joined late, let me tell you that this session was also recorded on our website. You can
I think we lost Sanjay there.
Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, so I think we lost Sanjay here. I'm actually sitting next to him. Hope you folks can hear me. He was just saying, thanks again, and hope we could all, join again. Next month, we are hoping some of other colleagues of Gopa on the Junglescape side, on the restoration side, to join us. Do look forward to having these conversations. Quite a few people we are looking at across the Nilgiri biosphere and across. So over the next few months, we hope to cover a lot of the restoration, riparian or otherwise, across these areas. And of course, in between, we will also be reaching out to others from across the world for speakers. So please do let us know if you have great speakers in mind, or if you want to talk about any conservation or restoration issue. We would love to have you speak to our audience here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gopa. I will definitely meet you in person with Vikram soon.